Thank you for joining us today on the Moms Who Know podcast, the podcast for moms who know that when they take care of themselves, they can take better care of everyone else. Today, James and I are here on our special Couples Who Know episode to talk a little bit about something we saw recently that we just got excited about this idea. We were watching a YouTube video with Sheila Ray Gregory, who is a marriage expert who I've followed for a while. She has a lot of good stuff. And she was talking about the idea in our marriage of being a peacemaker versus being a peacekeeper. So peacemaker is something that, at least in our family, we talk about a lot. When we see our kids fighting, we say, oh, be a peacemaker, find a way to work that out. And the idea of being a peacekeeper versus a peacemaker. So a peacekeeper is someone who keeps the peace at any cost without maybe working it out. So when I thought of that, I thought of the Hunger Games. And for those of you who have seen that, you know that in the book and in the movie, the peacekeepers are pretty much the police. When someone's breaking the rules, they go in and they enforce the rules and they make sure those rules are being kept. There is a peace that comes from that, right? It keeps things being followed. It keeps the, society working the way they want it to. But there's not that deep inner peace that comes from making peace, that comes from having the people in the society be a part of making the rules. And so while there is peace, as in lack of war, there's not peace as in joy and inner happiness and of a thriving society. And so if you think about that in your marriage, being a peacemaker, what that would mean for your marriage versus being a peacekeeper, that's what we're going to talk about today and a little bit about what that means. And so we'll get into this a little bit deeper as we go throughout this episode. To start us off, James, why don't you tell us some of the ways that you have been a peacemaker and some of the ways that you've been a peacekeeper, how this really applies?
You bet. You know what? I think it's easier to be a peacekeeper, at least for me, it has been, because when you're a peacekeeper, it means you're not actively engaging. You're not participating in whatever it is going around you. And the examples that stand out to me in our marriage, especially relating to kids, is just not being engaged at all. And I think I'm guilty of that, unfortunately. Maybe we all are at times. You see a confrontation or just something going down with your spouse and the kids, and it's like, oh, don't do that, or not even saying anything, or just going through the motions. I hope you know what I mean by that. It's easy to be the peacekeeper and, oh, dad's not engaging, so I'm just going to see what I can get away with mom. And you're uninterested. You're not willing to invest your time. When you're a peacekeeper, you're just going to do the bare minimum. That's what stands out in my mind. Ways that I've tried to be a peacemaker is by actively engaging, and also by being quick to forgive. I think that that's a pretty big key element in being a peacemaker. You're ready to forgive and you're ready to take action. So some of the ways that I'm thinking of that I've done that and asked the kids to do that is to work it out themselves and to be the mediator that can keep peace. But when we tell them, hey, stop that fighting, or please, be a peacemaker, see what you can do. This really stands out in one of our kids, and they did a great job of doing this. I forget which one of our boys did this, maybe the second oldest boy. We invited him to be a peacemaker. Because he was kind of getting into it a lot with his older brother. And we encouraged him and taught him ways how to be a peacemaker. And so some of the ways that we taught him how to do this were by serving. And he found ways to serve his siblings. That really helped him to be a peacemaker. What are some other ways that you can remember that he actively became a peacemaker?
I don't know anything that stands out specifically with that one, but I do know that it made a big difference in their relationship. And I think it's really interesting. how you're saying with being a peacekeeper, it's so easy to see this with our kids and to say, just stop. Just stop is the idea of peacekeeper. Don't go into the conflict, just make it stop. And being a peacemaker requires a lot more investment. And so while I don't know, specifically what he did to make it work, I know that it was more work, and yet it had a way better outcome.
It was, and that is for our relationship as well. For Chanel and I, if I'm going to be evasive, if I'm just going to not explore, when there's an issue there that you need to discuss and go into, and you're being evasive and not going into it and just don't want to talk about it because I don't want to go there because I don't want there to be a fight. That's being a peacekeeper. And there's a big difference, because if you're doing that and not going into the issue and talking it through, then there's a different feel. You're going to have the Hunger Game feel of there's just somebody watching out for and making it. It's like a forced rather than a willing or a submissive attitude. So if you could tell us, Chanel, some ways that you're a peacemaker and a peacekeeper.
Yeah, so when I thought about this idea, I thought about something that had happened a couple years ago. And what was happening was so you were really busy with work and with church obligations, and felt like Saturday was your day to sleep in. And I was also busy with kids and everything else that I had going on, and was getting really frustrated on Saturday mornings because there was never a time when I could sleep in. And every Saturday you would sleep in until, 9, not very late. We're early risers around here, but still, I would be up at 5 or 6 with the kids, and James would be sleeping, and I would be frustrated because I'd still be doing the breakfast and I'd still be doing everything. And it was easy for a while. I was really a peacekeeper about it. And what I mean by that is I let him do it. I didn't get mad at him. I didn't, have a fight about it or anything like that. And so probably in my mind, as time went on, I was feeling like, well, I'm being nice. However, silently, I was simmering. I was not happy about the situation, and it wasn't really working for me, but I was not bringing that out. And after a long time of this, we talked it out, and I brought it to his attention, and he didn't know. He just thought he could sleep in on Saturday mornings, and that was a thing. And we changed it, worked it out, figured out what was more workable for us and how that was going to work. And the interesting thing that stands out to me about that is, it took that conversation for there to be peace for both of us, so that instead of me trying to suppress kind of what I was feeling, it came out, and then we were able to actually come to real peace about it. So what stands out to me in that example, and what you were talking about earlier, James, is that really being a peacemaker requires more from us. And it requires, actually, it's kind of interesting because peacemaker sounds so wonderful and nice and sweet in some ways, but it requires actually confronting. And sometimes that can look a little bit messy, I would say. It can look a little bit of a mess.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's funny because when you were saying that, I was thinking about our kids. When they see us talking things through, they're thinking that maybe we're fighting, but really it's just sharing feelings. And I think it looks like it's a mess because it's the harder way to be a peacemaker sometimes, because you're sharing your true feelings. And sometimes when you're sharing your feelings, it can quickly escalate, or even just your tones. It sounds like they're upset, and that's what the kids were identifying. But it's so important to identify that in your spouse, I think, to let them express themselves. And for me, especially, not to be offended or thin-skinned about it when my spouse is sharing her feelings, because that is how we get peace. And that's her being a peacemaker. And so I think that is something that you can discover with your spouse. Discover how they share their feelings and let them do that without being thin-skinned about it. And if they're sharing feelings, I guess I would just say don't be quick to think that they're picking a fight. Just let them express themselves.
Yeah. So as we're talking about this, one thing that I'm thinking is being a peacemaker is like keeping the lid on. It's letting everything, and I used the word simmer earlier, and so I'm going to go with a cooking analogy here. But when you let that, you are having something simmer and you have a lid on the pot, right? It's still really hot in there and it's getting hot. And what happens is every once in a while when you're cooking something at a high temperature and you have a lid on, steam will come out, or a little bit of something will run down the side of the pan. And I feel like that happens in marriage when you're being a peacekeeper. So back to my earlier example with James sleeping in, I'm sure there were little snarky comments from me, which actually I know there were, I can remember. I would say, oh, you slept in for hours this morning. Or when he would take a nap, but did you enjoy your 5-hour nap? Stuff like that.
Yeah, and it was like 20 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. And I think I slept until like maybe 7:30. I don't know what the 9 o'clock stuff is. Okay,
well, the time is debatable. But anyway, so those little things would come out because even though I was, keeping a lid on it and trying to keep the peace, really I wasn't dealing with the underlying heat. So in this cooking analogy with that fire, I wasn't dealing with the fire. Being a peacekeeper requires turning the fire off. And to turn the fire off in a marriage situation is not as easy as just turning the burner off. That requires working it out and figuring it out and getting to the root of the problem, because it's not, the gas line that's causing the fire in marriage, it's something else. And so it's figuring out what is this fuel, what is the source, and how do we turn it off? And so that really, is the big difference there. Peacemaking is a process, and it's a process to come to peace, and it's worth it. But seeing what you're doing, if it's keeping the peace temporarily or if it's making peace long term. And that's another thing that's a difference between peacemaker and peacekeeper. You can only be a peacekeeper for so long. I've seen this in other marriages with people who, they don't fight, things are going along and things are fine. And then one of the partners just explodes and is so mad. And maybe the other person didn't even know anything was wrong. And there's so much built up resentment, which is another word that I think fits in really well with the whole idea of peacekeeper, because there's that underlying resentment. Even though on the outside there's peace, on the inside there is some resentment. So James, talk to us a little bit about being a peacemaker. How do you choose to be a peacemaker and work through these difficulties and get to the heart of the issue without anger and without contention?
Sure. First, I just want to say I really like those analogies that you share with us, because I think it rings true. I think we can all understand that. And I think that we've been there with simmering or steaming or flipping our lid or whatever you want to call it. I think, to your question, it takes practice and it takes understanding how your spouse expresses themselves. I touched on that a little bit earlier, but maybe if I can go a little bit deeper here, I think for me, I'll share personal experience that I had to learn how my wife expressed herself and not take offense. So I can be a little bit thin-skinned. I think maybe all of us can at sometimes, but I think you have to let go of that sense of I want to be right. And with the sleeping situation that Chanel was talking about earlier, I thought it was okay. Like we're good, right? Because you haven't said anything. And, whereas I don't know how long that went on before we had the discussion about it, but I think you're going to take cues from one another. And if you can pick up on those cues, like, hey, I sensed something is frustrating you or really bothering you. I think that if you can pick up on that and be sensitive to it and talk about it early on in the game, wow, that'll be huge down the line, because it'll avoid this huge simmering process that's going on. The flame, if you will, won't be as hot, or it won't be on high. Won't get to that point. So I would say, if you could just be patient and really learn how your spouse expresses themselves, let them express themselves. I don't think it has to be abusive or anything, like if they want to scream or, that's probably not a good way to express your emotion. But if they're just talking to you and telling you how they feel about something, don't take offense, and really try to listen. And as you practice letting the steam out slowly, it's going to help you for future problems that may arise, and help you become a peacemaker in the end.
Yeah. One thing, as you were saying that I was thinking is, in learning about each other, I know when I get excited about something or just feel strongly about it, I really do have to watch my tone. And I think that that's something that you have also learned about me, that, oh, well, just because I'm talking,
Because it felt like you were yelling at me,
yeah,
right?
just because I'm super excited about something, it doesn't mean that I'm mad. It's just that I'm, super excited, passionate about whatever we're talking about. And so, and then of course that goes both ways, because I still have to watch it. I can't get to the point where I am yelling, and I'm not really a yeller, but I don't know. I just still have to watch it. And yeah.
I was going to flip this around. I think what you've learned from me is that I'll be a little bit more methodical. I'll be slower to express my feelings. I don't know if that's a guy thing, but I'll need time to sit on it and think about what it is that bothers me. Or, it may have been stewing for a while, whatever the issue was. And it takes me a little bit longer to identify that. I think you're a little bit quicker to identify how you feel.
Yeah.
And that's harder for me to express, I guess.
Yeah. And that's something else that we've had to learn and work through, is I need to give him time, because, and I think that is generally true for men and women, that men may be generally, women verbally, we're coming up with all this stuff and we have all these emotions going on, and men are, a little wired a little bit differently. And so as a wife, I need to give him time to process and time to think about that. And so instead of coming up with all these really great, things to back up my point, because that's not the point. The point, I think James mentioned earlier, is not being right. The point is coming together and coming to agreement and coming to peace. And so being a peacemaker without anger and contention, for me, means listening. And it means, yes, expressing what I feel and getting it out there and making sure that is said in a way that James can understand. So not an angry way, but a way that I'm actually sharing what I feel. And then listening. Listening is super important component of this, because we can't come to peace unless we're both there. In this example that I shared earlier with sleeping in, had the solution been, well, I need to sleep in on Saturdays and you need to get up every morning, early so that I can sleep in, I don't think that would have been a peaceful solution either, even though, it would have worked out great for me, right? I think then it would have swung too far the other way. Peace is when we can both feel good about the situation. We're both being heard and we're working it out.
I think that's so true. I think that you can get there together. You really can. And I think that you have to be full of hope. I can think of so many couples who really struggle with this. They're just so angry. And they feel like, how can there be any peace when my spouse is so angry, when maybe they're both being angry? And if you can just seek to be a peacemaker, seek to show ways that you are interested. We started this off with, it's harder to be the peacemaker, right? Because it's not shoving it under the carpet. It's going to take some effort. You're going to have to show active participation, if you will, in coming to the peace together. So I think it's been a fun journey to get to know my spouse, and we're still discovering and learning how to be a peacemaker with each other. We're helping our kids being peacemakers together, and I think when I share with them how to be a peacemaker, it helps me to be a better peacemaker with my spouse. So that's one way to learn. I talked about practice. So try to be a coach to your kids, and then and then hopefully it'll rub off when you're talking to your spouse.
Yeah, definitely. I love this conversation about being a peacemaker because I think that it shows us kind of the end goal, because sometimes it can just seem so easy in the moment to let things go. And when we're thinking about what we really want that connection. And the way to get there is sometimes through those hard conversations. Getting to peace, being a peacemaker is the harder road, but definitely the road that's worth it. So I encourage you to spend some time thinking about that. And the question for this week is, what are some ways that you can be a peacemaker? I'd love to hear in your marriage how you do that, with your kids how you do that, some things that you do to be a peacemaker. And share those on Instagram or Facebook at Moms Who Know Podcast so that we can learn from you. We love it when you comment. I love learning from you guys. I hope you have learned some ideas today. Thank you so much for being with us on Moms Who Know.